The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the trading post, and Ophelia Owens stepped down onto frozen ground with legs that could barely hold her weight after 3 weeks of bone-rattling travel from Boston to this God-forsaken corner of Nevada territory. Genoa stretched before her like a collection of wooden boxes scattered across a snowy valley, the Sierra Nevada mountains looming in the distance like sleeping giants dusted with winter's fury. It was January 1872, and the cold bit through her wool coat as if the fabric were nothing more than paper. She clutched her carpetbag with fingers gone numb inside her threadbare gloves, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she searched the handful of people gathered near the general store for a face that might belong to Fletcher Irwin, the rancher who had sent for her through the matrimonial agency back east. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a reminder of the terrible gamble she had taken. 3 months ago, she had been a seamstress in a cramped boarding house, stitching other women's dreams into silk and satin while her own future narrowed to a pinpoint. When Mrs. Henderson at the agency had shown her Fletcher's advertisement, describing a cattle ranch in Nevada territory, and a man seeking a wife who could endure hardship and isolation, Ophelia had signed the papers before fear could change her mind. Now, standing in this frozen wilderness, fear had caught up with her after all. A tall figure detached itself from the cluster of men near the hitching post. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape, his worn leather coat hanging open despite the bitter cold, his broad-brimmed hat shadowing a face she could not yet see clearly. As he drew closer, Ophelia forced herself to stand straighter, to meet whatever fate approached with something resembling dignity. "Miss Owens." His voice was deeper than she had expected, rough as gravel but not unkind. He stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat, revealing dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined at the corners of his eyes and mouth in a way that suggested he was somewhere in his early 30s, perhaps 10 years her senior. A scar cut a thin white line through his left eyebrow. "I'm Fletcher Irwin." Ophelia managed a small nod, her jaw clenched tight to keep her teeth from chattering. She had rehearsed a dozen greetings during the long journey west, but now every word had fled. All she could think was that this stranger, this man with careful eyes and calloused hands, held her entire future in his grasp. The realization made her want to climb back into the stagecoach and demand they take her home, except there was no home to return to anymore. Fletcher studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Concern, perhaps, or disappointment. She knew what he must see. A woman too thin from weeks of travel and months of barely scraping by, her dark auburn hair coming loose from its pins, her face pale and drawn, her eyes too wide with barely contained panic. Not the hardy frontier wife he had surely hoped for. "You are freezing," he said, stating the obvious with such gentle matter-of-factness that tears pricked at Ophelia's eyes. "Come on, let us get you somewhere warm." He reached for her carpetbag, and she let him take it, following as he led her toward a wagon hitched outside the trading post. His movements were economical, practiced, as he stowed her bag in the back and then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hand on her elbow was steady, supporting without presuming, and when she was settled, he draped a heavy buffalo hide across her lap. "My ranch is about 5 miles north," Fletcher said as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "The house is not much, but it is warm and dry. We will get you thawed out and fed, and then we can talk." Ophelia nodded again, still unable to find her voice. As the wagon rolled forward, she snuck glances at the man beside her. His profile was strong, all sharp angles and determined lines, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested weariness, a burden carried for too long. His hands on the reins were scarred and roughened by work, the hands of a man who built things and mended things and survived things. The landscape rolled past in shades of white and gray and brown, the snow lying thick across the valley floor, sage and scrub poking through in dark patches. The silence between them grew heavy, weighted with all the things they did not know about each other, and all the expectations they both carried. Ophelia hugged the buffalo hide closer, and tried not to think about the fact that she had promised to marry this stranger, that in a few days or weeks she would be his wife in every sense, bound to him for the rest of her life. "I know this must be frightening," Fletcher said suddenly, his eyes still on the road ahead. "Coming all this way to marry a man you have never met. I want you to know that I will not rush you into anything. We will take our time getting to know each other. If you decide this is not what you want, I will pay your passage back east. No questions asked." The kindness in his words hit Ophelia like a physical blow. She had braced herself for demands, for immediate expectations, for a man who would see her as property purchased through the mail. Instead, here was an offer of escape, of choice, delivered in a voice that held no anger or resentment. "I have nowhere to go back to," she heard herself say, the words scraped raw from her throat. "My parents are dead. I have no siblings. The boarding house where I lived sold last month, and my position was eliminated. This is my only option." Fletcher turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she met his gaze despite the vulnerability it cost her. She saw understanding there and something else, something that looked almost like kinship. "Then we will make the best of it," he said simply. "I may not be much, and this life is harder than anything you have known, but I give you my word that I will treat you with respect and do my best to make you comfortable." "Why?" The question escaped before Ophelia could stop it. "Why did you send for a mail-order bride? Surely there are women in town." A ghost of a smile touched Fletcher's lips, wry and self-deprecating. "Not many, and the few who are here have better prospects than a struggling rancher. I have been working my land for 8 years, building it up from nothing. It is a good piece of property with water rights and room for expansion, but it is lonely work. I suppose I got tired of coming home to an empty house." The honesty in his answer loosened something in Ophelia's chest. She understood loneliness, had lived with it like a constant companion for years after her parents' deaths. Perhaps that was something they could share, something to build on. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, and Ophelia's breath caught. A modest log house sat nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, smoke curling from its chimney. A barn and several outbuildings clustered nearby, and she could see cattle gathered in a fenced pasture, dark shapes against the snow. It was small compared to the grand estates she had glimpsed in Boston, but there was something solid and real about it, something that spoke of hard work and determination. Fletcher pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. "Wait there," he said, climbing down and coming around to her side. He lifted his arms to help her down, and when Ophelia placed her hands on his shoulders, she felt the strength in him, the steadiness. He set her on her feet as carefully as if she were made of glass, then grabbed her carpetbag from the back. The inside of the house was blessedly warm, heat radiating from a cast iron stove in the main room. Ophelia stood just inside the door, taking in her surroundings. The space was simply furnished but clean, with a table and chairs, a few shelves holding books and dishes, a rocking chair near the stove. A doorway led to what she assumed was a bedroom. Everything was neat and orderly, the home of a man who took care of what he had. "Sit by the stove," Fletcher said, setting down her bag and moving to fill a kettle with water. "I will make coffee and fix something to eat." Ophelia sank into the rocking chair, her body trembling now that she was finally still. She watched as Fletcher moved around the room with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, setting the kettle to heat, slicing bread and pulling out cold beef and cheese. He worked without speaking, and she was grateful for the silence, for the chance to simply exist without having to perform or explain or justify her presence. When he brought her a plate of food and a cup of strong black coffee, she took them with shaking hands. "Thank you," she managed, and the words felt inadequate for everything he had offered her in the past hour. Fletcher pulled one of the chairs over and sat facing her, his own coffee cup cradled in his hands. "Eat," he said gently. "Then we can talk or you can rest. Whatever you need." Ophelia forced herself to take a bite of bread, then another. The food was simple but good, and she realized she had not eaten properly in days. As warmth and nourishment began to seep into her body, the crushing fear that had gripped her since arriving started to ease, just slightly. She glanced up at Fletcher and found him watching her with an expression that held no judgment, only patience. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I thought I would be braver, more prepared. But when I stepped off that stagecoach and saw this place, saw you, I realized what I had really done. I have promised to spend my life with someone I do not know, in a place I do not understand." "You are one of the bravest people I have ever met," Fletcher replied, his voice steady. "It takes courage to leave everything you know and travel halfway across the country on nothing but hope and a stranger's word. I respect that, Ophelia. I respect you." The use of her given name, spoken with such sincerity, brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, not wanting to dissolve into weeping in front of this man, but one escaped anyway, tracking hot down her cold cheek. Fletcher leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I know I cannot erase your fear overnight. I know that trust has to be earned. So here is what I propose. You take the bedroom. I will sleep out here. We will spend our days getting to know each other, working together, learning each other's rhythms. When you are ready, when you feel comfortable, we will talk about marriage. Until then, you are simply a guest in my home under my protection. Does that sound acceptable?" Ophelia stared at him, astonishment warring with relief. "You would do that? Wait, I mean. Most men would insist on their rights immediately." "I am not most men," Fletcher said quietly. "And I have no interest in claiming rights over someone who sees me as a threat. I want a wife, yes, but I want a partner, someone who chooses to be here. That cannot happen if you are afraid of me." The words settled into Ophelia's heart like seeds planted in fertile ground. She nodded slowly, setting down her cup. "Then I accept your proposal, and I thank you for your kindness, Fletcher. I will try to be worthy of it." "You already are," he said, and the simple conviction in his voice made her believe, for the first time since leaving Boston, that perhaps she had made the right choice after all. The first days at the ranch passed in a strange, careful dance of proximity and distance. Fletcher kept his word, sleeping on a bedroll by the stove while Ophelia occupied the small bedroom. Each morning, she woke to find coffee already made and the fire built high. Fletcher would be outside tending to the cattle, or repairing fences or hauling wood, and she would stand at the window watching him work, this man who had offered her safety without asking for anything in return. She tried to make herself useful, to justify her presence. She cleaned the house thoroughly, discovering corners Fletcher had neglected in his bachelor existence. She mended his clothes, her seamstress skills finally put to practical use. She attempted to cook, though her experience was limited to the basic meals she had made for herself in her boarding house room, and the results were often more humble than she would have liked. Fletcher never complained. He ate whatever she put in front of him with apparent gratitude, and when she apologized for the burned biscuits or the tough stew meat, he simply said, "It is better than anything I would have made," and meant it. In the evenings, they sat by the stove and talked. Fletcher told her about the ranch, about the years he had spent building it up from a simple land claim to something that could sustain a family. He spoke of his parents, who had died in a cholera outbreak when he was 20, leaving him alone in California with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to work. He described his journey to Nevada, drawn by the promise of good grazing land and the independence of owning something that was truly his. Ophelia, in turn, shared her own story. She spoke of her father, a bookkeeper who had encouraged her education, who had taught her to read and write and think for herself. She described her mother, a gentle woman who had died when Ophelia was 16, leaving a hole in their small family that never quite healed. She talked about her father's death 3 years later from pneumonia and the desperate scramble to survive in a city that had no use for educated women without family or fortune. "I tried to be a teacher," she admitted one night, her hands busy with darning one of Fletcher's socks. "But the schools wanted references, connections. I had none. So I became a seamstress because at least I could sew. But the pay was barely enough to cover my room and food, and I knew I could not do it forever. When Mrs. Henderson told me about the matrimonial agency, it felt like the only door left open to me." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, whittling a piece of wood by the stove light. "Finally," he said, "my mother used to say that sometimes the narrowest door leads to the widest room. Maybe that is what this is for both of us." Ophelia looked up from her mending, meeting his eyes across the warm space between them. "Maybe," she said softly, and allowed herself to hope. As the days turned into weeks, Ophelia began to understand the rhythm of ranch life. She learned that Fletcher rose before dawn, that he checked on the cattle multiple times each day, that his work was never truly done. She saw how he handled the animals with firm gentleness, how he spoke to his horse as if it were a trusted friend, how he could read the weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds. She also began to see the man beneath the weathered exterior. She noticed how he always set aside the choicest pieces of meat for her at meals, how he left her small gifts without comment, wildflowers pressed between book pages, a ribbon purchased in town, how he listened when she spoke, truly listened, as if her words and thoughts mattered. The frozen fear that had gripped her heart since arriving began, slowly, to thaw. One afternoon in early February, Ophelia was outside hanging laundry when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She turned to see 3 riders coming up the road toward the ranch, and something in their manner made her nervous. She hurried inside to find Fletcher, who was repairing a harness at the kitchen table. "Riders coming," she said, and he looked up sharply. Fletcher set aside his work and stood, moving to the window. His jaw tightened as he watched the approaching men. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "These are not friends." "Who are they?" Ophelia asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "Neighbors," Fletcher replied, but the word sounded like a curse. "The Dalton brothers. They have been trying to buy my land for 2 years, and they do not like taking no for an answer." Before Ophelia could respond, the riders pulled up outside, and Fletcher stepped onto the porch to meet them. She positioned herself by the window where she could see and hear without being too visible. The 3 men who dismounted were cut from similar cloth, all broad-shouldered and hard-eyed, dressed in range clothes that spoke of money and confidence. The eldest, a man with graying hair and a thick mustache, stepped forward. "Irwin," he said, his tone carrying false friendliness. "Heard you got yourself a mail-order bride. Came to offer congratulations. "Your concern is noted, Dalton," Fletcher replied evenly. "Now you can ride on." The man called Dalton laughed, a sound without humor. "Not very hospitable, are you? Thought maybe with a woman around you might be more inclined to be neighborly, more inclined to sell, perhaps." "My answer has not changed," Fletcher said, his voice hardening. "The ranch is not for sale, not now. Not ever." One of the younger Dalton brothers spat into the snow. "You are stubborn, Irwin, stubborn and foolish. This valley is not big enough for both our operations. You would do better to take our offer and move on before something unfortunate happens." Fletcher took a step forward, and even through the window, Ophelia could see the tension coiling in his body. "Is that a threat, Jake?" "Just friendly advice," the younger man replied with a cold grin. "Then here is some friendly advice in return," Fletcher said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Get off my land. Now. And do not come back unless you are invited." The three Dalton brothers exchanged glances, and for a moment Ophelia thought violence would erupt. Her hand went to her throat, her heart pounding. But the elder Dalton held up a hand, restraining his brothers. "We will go," he said. "But think about what I said, Irwin. A man with a wife has more to lose than a man alone, more to protect. It would be a shame if anything happened to disturb your domestic bliss." The implied threat hung in the cold air like smoke. Fletcher did not move, did not respond, but Ophelia saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. The Dalton brothers mounted their horses and rode off, their laughter carrying back across the snow. When they were out of sight, Fletcher stood on the porch for a long moment before turning back to the house. Ophelia met him at the door, her face pale. "Who are they really?" she asked. "And what did they mean about something unfortunate happening?" Fletcher ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "They own a big spread south of here. They have been buying up smaller ranches, consolidating their holdings. My land has good water and they want it. They have tried buying me out, but when that did not work, they started trying other methods." "What kind of methods?" Ophelia pressed, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. "Fences cut, cattle scattered. My barn caught fire last spring, though I managed to put it out before it spread. Nothing I can prove, but I know it was them." He looked at her, his expression troubled. "I am sorry, Ophelia. I should have told you about this before you came. You have a right to know what you are walking into." Ophelia considered this, weighing the new information against everything else she had learned about Fletcher in the past weeks. "Would it have changed anything?" she asked. "If you had told me in your letters about the Dalton brothers and their threats," Fletcher met her gaze. "I do not know. Maybe. I am already here," Ophelia said simply. "And I am not leaving because of some bullies who think they can intimidate you into selling. You have worked too hard to build this place to let them take it from you." Something shifted in Fletcher's expression, a warmth kindling in his eyes. "You sound very certain for someone who was frozen with fear a few weeks ago." "Maybe your kindness is thawing more than just my heart," Ophelia replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Maybe it is thawing my courage too." Fletcher took a step closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Ophelia," he said softly, "you have always been brave. You just needed to remember it." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and Ophelia felt her breath catch. But Fletcher stepped back, giving her space, respecting the boundaries he had set. "I need to ride out and check the herd," he said. "Make sure the Daltons did not do anything while they were here." "Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" "I will be fine," Ophelia assured him, though her hands were still shaking slightly. "Be careful." "Always am," Fletcher said, grabbing his coat and hat. At the door he paused and looked back. "Thank you," he said, "for standing with me." It means more than you know." After he left, Ophelia sank into the rocking chair, her mind racing. The encounter with the Dalton brothers had shaken her, but it had also clarified something. Fletcher was not just a stranger who had sent for a wife through the mail. He was a good man facing real challenges, trying to protect something he had built with his own hands. And somehow, without quite meaning to, she had begun to care what happened to him. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. She had come west expecting to fulfill a contract, to exchange security for duty. She had not expected to find herself drawn to Fletcher's quiet strength, his steady kindness, the way he looked at her as if she mattered. She had not expected to start imagining a future here that went beyond mere survival. Fletcher returned as the sun was setting, his expression grim. "2 head missing," he reported, "and fresh tracks leading toward Dalton land. Can you report it to the law?" Ophelia asked, ladling stew into a bowl for him. "The nearest marshal is in Carson City, 2 days' ride, and like I said, I cannot prove anything." Fletcher sat heavily at the table, accepting the food with a nod of thanks. "This is how they work, small annoyances that add up over time, designed to wear me down until I give up and sell." "But you will not give up," Ophelia said. "It was not a question." "No," Fletcher agreed. "This land is all I have, all I am. I will not let them take it." Ophelia sat across from him, her own meal forgotten. "Then we will figure out how to protect it, together." Fletcher looked at her for a long moment, and she saw vulnerability flash across his face before he carefully schooled his expression. "You keep saying we," he said quietly. "As if you are already committed to staying." "Am I not?" Ophelia asked, her heart suddenly pounding. "You sent for me to be your wife. I came here for that purpose. The only question was timing, not outcome." "But I told you that you could leave if you wanted," Fletcher reminded her. "That the choice was yours." Ophelia took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I do not want to leave. These past weeks, getting to know you, learning about this place, I have realized something. I am not afraid anymore. Or rather, I am still afraid of many things, the Daltons and the harshness of this life and my own inadequacies. But I am not afraid of you, and I am not afraid of choosing to stay." The words hung in the warm air between them, honest and raw and true. Fletcher set down his spoon, his attention entirely focused on her. "Ophelia, are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I want to be your wife," Ophelia replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Not just in name, but truly, if you will still have me." Fletcher stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, Ophelia thought she had made a terrible mistake, had presumed too much. But then he was kneeling beside her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "If I will still have you," he repeated, wonder and disbelief mixing in his voice. "Ophelia, from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, looking terrified and determined in equal measure, I have been hoping you would choose to stay. I have been trying to give you time and space, to let you make the decision without pressure, but every day has been an exercise in patience, wanting to tell you how much I have come to admire you, to care for you, but not wanting to overwhelm you." Ophelia felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and joy rather than fear. "You care for me?" she asked softly. "How could I not?" Fletcher replied, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. "You are brave and strong and kind. You have taken this harsh life and made it into something warm and welcoming. You have made this house into a home. You have made me remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting beyond just land and cattle." "I am not brave," Ophelia protested. "I arrived here frozen and terrified." "And I said I would thaw your heart with kindness," Fletcher reminded her, a smile tugging at his lips. "But the truth is, you have been thawing mine too. I did not realize how cold and closed off I had become until you arrived and started letting light back in." Ophelia cupped his face with her free hand, feeling the rasp of stubble against her palm, the solid warmth of him. "Then we have thawed each other," she said. "And now we build something new together." Fletcher leaned forward, his intention clear, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Ophelia did not pull away. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it deepened as weeks of careful restraint gave way to honest emotion. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "We should get married as soon as possible," he murmured. "I want you to have the protection of my name and the legal rights of my wife before anything else happens with the Daltons." "Then we will go to town tomorrow," Ophelia agreed, "and find whoever can perform the ceremony." That night, Fletcher still slept by the stove, honoring the boundaries they had maintained. But they sat together until late, hands clasped, making plans for their future. They talked about expanding the herd, about building onto the house, about all the small dreams that became possible when two people faced them together instead of alone. When Ophelia finally retreated to the bedroom, she lay awake for a long time, listening to Fletcher moving around in the main room as he prepared his bedroll. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow she would become his wife in truth, binding her life to his in front of witnesses and law. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it filled her with a warm anticipation that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hope. The morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak underfoot and turned breath into ice crystals in the air. Fletcher hitched the wagon while Ophelia dressed in the best clothes she had, a dark blue wool dress that she had made herself years ago and carefully preserved. She arranged her hair with extra care, pinning it up in a style that was both practical and feminine, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror that hung by the washstand. She looked different than she had a month ago. The drawn, frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach had been replaced by someone with color in her cheeks and brightness in her eyes, someone who looked like she belonged here. The transformation startled her, but it also filled her with pride. She had survived the journey west. She had survived her fear. Now she was choosing her future with clear eyes and an open heart. Fletcher was waiting by the wagon, and when he saw her, he went very still. "You look beautiful," he said, the words simple but sincere. "Thank you," Ophelia replied, accepting his hand as he helped her up to the seat. "So do you." Fletcher glanced down at his own clothes, his best shirt and coat, cleaned and pressed by Ophelia's careful hands. A hint of color touched his weathered cheeks. "I clean up all right when I have reason to," he admitted. The ride to Genoa took over an hour, the wagon wheels crunching through frozen snow, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. But Fletcher had piled buffalo robes in the seat, and Ophelia tucked herself against his side, stealing his warmth. He draped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close, and she marveled at how natural it felt, how right. Genoa was barely awake when they arrived, a handful of people moving between buildings, smoke rising from chimneys. Fletcher drove directly to a white-painted building that served as both church and community hall, and helped Ophelia down. Inside, they found Reverend Hollis, a thin man with kind eyes and a magnificent beard, stoking the fire in the small stove. He looked up as they entered, his face breaking into a welcoming smile. "Fletcher Irwin," he said warmly. "I heard you had sent for a bride. Is this she?" "This is Ophelia Owens," Fletcher confirmed, his hand resting at the small of her back. "We would like to be married today, if you can accommodate us." Reverend Holly studied them both for a moment, and Ophelia had the sense that he was seeing more than just two people seeking his services. Finally, he nodded. "I can accommodate you, but I need 2 witnesses." "Let me send for the Johnsons. They live just up the road and will be happy to help." While they waited, Reverend Hollis had them fill out the necessary paperwork, recording their names and ages and places of origin in his careful script. Ophelia watched her signature appear on the marriage register and felt the weight of what she was about to do. This was real. This was permanent. This was her choice. The Johnsons arrived shortly, a middle-aged couple with weathered faces and friendly smiles. Mrs. Johnson hugged Ophelia as if she were a long-lost daughter. "So good to have another woman in the area," she said warmly. "You must come visit once you are settled. The winters are long and we all need each other to get through them." The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Reverend Holly spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about partnership and commitment, and the promises 2 people made before God and community. When he asked if Fletcher would take Ophelia as his lawfully wedded wife, Fletcher's "I will" was firm and clear. When it was Ophelia's turn, she looked into Fletcher's eyes and saw everything she needed to see there: steadiness, honesty, hope, and something that looked remarkably like love. "I will," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. They had no rings to exchange, but Fletcher produced a thin gold band that had belonged to his mother, kept carefully wrapped in cloth for years. He slid it onto Ophelia's finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. "With this ring I thee wed," Fletcher said, the old words taking on new meaning. "And I promise to honor and protect you for all the days of my life." Ophelia blinked back tears as she looked down at the ring, warm and bright on her hand. "And I promise to stand beside you," she replied, improvising because no one had told her what words to say. "In hardship and in joy for all the days of mine." "Then by the power vested in me," Reverend Hollis said, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and authority, "I pronounce you husband and wife. Fletcher, you may kiss your bride." This kiss was different from the one they had shared the night before. This kiss was a promise kept and a future claimed, witnessed and blessed. When they broke apart, Mrs. Johnson was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even Mr. Johnson looked suspiciously misty. They signed the register again, this time as husband and wife, and Reverend Hollis handed Fletcher the marriage certificate with a smile. "May you have many happy years together," he said, "and many children to fill that ranch of yours." Outside, the cold seemed less biting, the sky less gray. Fletcher helped Ophelia into the wagon with extra care, as if marriage had made her more precious, more fragile. But when she caught his eye, she saw the heat there, the barely restrained desire, and realized that he was simply holding himself in check until they were home. They stopped at the general store for supplies, and word of their marriage had already spread. The shopkeeper congratulated them, and several townspeople offered well wishes. But Ophelia also noticed the sidelong glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when they drew near. Small-town gossip, she supposed, about the mail-order bride and the rancher who had been trying to make it alone for so long. As they were loading their supplies into the wagon, a familiar voice called out, "Well, well, if it is not the newlyweds." Ophelia turned to see the elder Dalton brother approaching, flanked by his siblings. Her hand tightened on the edge of the wagon, but Fletcher stepped smoothly between her and the Daltons, his body a shield. "Dalton," he acknowledged coolly, "we have nothing to discuss." "Oh, I think we do," Dalton replied, his eyes sliding past Fletcher to Ophelia. "Got yourself properly hitched, did you? Must be nice, having someone to warm your bed on these cold nights. Be a shame if something happened to interrupt that domestic bliss." Fletcher's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. You have made your position clear, multiple times, and my answer remains the same. The ranch is not for sale. Threatening my wife will not change that. Threatening? Dalton's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Who said anything about threats? I am simply noting the dangers of frontier life. Accidents happen. Houses burn. People disappear. Just concerned for your safety is all. Before Fletcher could respond, Ophelia stepped around him, her fear transmuted into fury. Then let me make something clear to you, Mr. Dalton, she said, her voice ringing with unexpected authority. I am not some helpless woman to be intimidated by veiled threats. I came west knowing the risks, and I married Fletcher with full knowledge of the situation. You want his land. You will have to go through both of us, and I promise you that will be considerably more difficult than you seem to think. Silence followed her words. Dalton stared at her, clearly taken aback by the steel in her spine. Even Fletcher looked surprised. Finally, Dalton laughed, but it was an uncertain sound. You have got spirit, Mrs. Irwin, he said, but spirit does not stop bullets or fires. No, Ophelia agreed, but witnesses do, and records, and the law. You have been operating in shadows, making it impossible for Fletcher to prove your involvement. But I am educated, Mr. Dalton. I keep detailed records, and I have already written letters to the territorial marshal describing your harassment and threats. Those letters are in the hands of friends back east with instructions to mail them if anything should happen to us. So if you are planning something unfortunate, I suggest you reconsider, because there will be consequences. It was a complete bluff. Ophelia had written no such letters, had no such friends standing by. But her voice did not waver and her gaze did not falter, and after a tense moment, something shifted in Dalton's expression. Smart woman, he said finally. Too smart for the likes of Irwin, I would say. Sure you would not rather be with a man who can actually provide for you. Man with a bigger spread and deeper pockets. I am exactly where I choose to be, Ophelia replied. Now if you will excuse us, my husband and I have a home to return to. She turned her back on him deliberately, a calculated insult, and climbed into the wagon seat. Fletcher joined her a moment later, taking up the reins. As they pulled away, Ophelia could feel the weight of Dalton's stare on her back, but she did not look around. Only when they were well out of town did Fletcher speak. That was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, he said, but there was admiration in his voice. Probably both. Did you really write those letters? No, Ophelia admitted, but he does not know that, and now he has to wonder. Doubt is a powerful weapon. Fletcher laughed, a sound of pure delight. I married a dangerous woman, he said. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Too late, Ophelia replied with a small smile. I am already on your side, which means anyone who threatens you is automatically on my bad side. Fletcher reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. I do not deserve you, he said quietly. Probably not, Ophelia agreed, squeezing his hand. But you are stuck with me now. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, hands clasped, shoulders touching. The ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. It looked different to Ophelia now, not like a strange and frightening place, but like home. Fletcher pulled the wagon up to the house and turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. Before we go inside, he said, I want to ask you something. I know we are married now, and I know what that usually means, but I still want you to feel comfortable. So I am asking, not assuming. Do you want me to continue sleeping by the stove tonight? Ophelia felt warmth bloom in her chest at his consideration, at the way he continued to prioritize her comfort over his own desires. No, she said softly. I want you to sleep beside me, as my husband." Something flared in Fletcher's eyes, heat and tenderness combined. "Are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything," Ophelia replied, and it was true. The fear that had gripped her for so long had burned away, leaving only anticipation and trust. Fletcher climbed down and came around to help her, but instead of simply offering his hand, he swept her up into his arms, carrying her toward the house. Ophelia laughed, surprised and delighted by the gesture. "What are you doing?" she asked, her arms looping around his neck. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Fletcher replied, kicking the door open. "It is tradition, is it not?" "I believe it is," Ophelia agreed, and kissed him as he carried her inside. He set her down gently in the main room, the fire still burning low in the stove from the morning. For a moment they simply stood there, husband and wife, facing the reality of what came next. Then Fletcher cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. "I will be gentle," he promised, "and patient. Tell me if anything is too much, if you need me to stop or slow down." "I trust you," Ophelia said simply, and watched his expression transform with wonder and responsibility and love. What passed between them that night was private and sacred, a claiming and a giving that bound them together in ways beyond law or words. Fletcher kept his promise of gentleness, treating Ophelia with such tender care that any lingering nervousness melted away. She learned the landscape of his body, the scars and calluses that told the story of his life. He learned hers, every curve and soft place, worshipping her as if she were something precious and rare. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Ophelia's head resting on Fletcher's chest, his arms secure around her. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, a rhythm that promised safety and permanence. "I love you," Fletcher said into the darkness, the words quiet but absolute. "I know it is fast and maybe you are not ready to hear it, but I need you to know. I love you, Ophelia. Not just because you are my wife, but because of who you are. Your courage and your strength and the way you face the world head-on despite your fear." Ophelia lifted her head to look at him, seeing his face illuminated by moonlight filtering through the window. "I love you too," she said, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. "I did not expect it, did not think I could fall in love with someone I barely knew, but somehow you have become everything to me. My home, my family, my future." Fletcher pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "Then we will build that future together," he murmured. "Whatever comes, we face it side by side." Ophelia smiled against his skin, contentment settling over her like a warm blanket. She had arrived in Nevada territory frozen and afraid, barely able to imagine a path forward. But Fletcher had kept his word. He had thawed her heart with kindness, with patience, with the steady warmth of his presence. And in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift possible. A reason to hope, a reason to love, a reason to stay. The winter deepened around them, but inside the ranch house, spring was already blooming. The weeks following their wedding settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, as if Ophelia had been living this life forever. She rose each morning to find Fletcher already awake, his side of the bed still warm but empty as he tended to the pre-dawn chores. She would dress quickly in the cold air and hurry to the main room to start breakfast, learning by trial and error what Fletcher liked and how to manage the temperamental stove. He never complained about the burned bacon or the coffee that was sometimes too weak or too strong. Instead, he praised her improving skills, celebrating small victories like perfectly risen biscuits or a stew that had the meat tender instead of tough. His encouragement gave her confidence, and she found herself taking pride in these domestic tasks that had once seemed so daunting. The days developed their own patterns. After breakfast, Fletcher would head out to work the ranch while Ophelia tackled indoor tasks. She cleaned and organized, finding clever ways to maximize the limited space. She sewed curtains for the windows, transforming the stark interior into something warmer and more welcoming. She experimented with recipes, stretching their supplies creatively. But she also began to venture outside more, learning the workings of the ranch. She fed the chickens Fletcher had mentioned he kept behind the barn, collecting eggs and marveling at the simple satisfaction of gathering food with her own hands. She learned to recognize which cattle were which, noting their markings and personalities. She watched Fletcher work, studying how he moved among the animals with calm authority. One afternoon in late February, she asked if she could help with the feeding. Fletcher looked surprised but pleased and showed her how to pitch hay and distribute grain. The work was harder than it looked, leaving her arms aching and her back sore, but there was a deep satisfaction in it too. She was contributing, truly helping rather than just maintaining the house. "You are a natural," Fletcher told her that evening as she soaked her tired hands in warm water. "Most city women never adjust to ranch work." "I am not most city women," Ophelia replied with a small smile, echoing his words from weeks ago. Fletcher grinned and kissed the top of her head. "No, you certainly are not." The physical intimacy between them continued to grow and deepen. What had been gentle and tentative that first night became more confident and passionate as they learned each other's desires. Ophelia discovered that she had appetites she had never known existed, and Fletcher was an attentive and generous lover, always attuned to her pleasure as much as his own. But it was the small moments of tenderness that truly defined their relationship. The way Fletcher would brush snow from her hair when she came inside. How Ophelia would massage his shoulders after a long day of heavy labor. The quiet evenings spent reading aloud to each other from Fletcher's small collection of books, or simply sitting together in companionable silence while she mended and he carved small figures from wood. They talked about everything and nothing. Fletcher shared his dreams for the ranch, describing pastures he wanted to improve and buildings he hoped to construct. Ophelia spoke of the books she had read and the world beyond Nevada territory, sharing knowledge Fletcher had never had the opportunity to acquire. They taught each other, filling in the gaps in each other's education and experience. "You should have been a teacher," Fletcher said one night after Ophelia had explained the principles of crop rotation she had read about. "You have a gift for making complicated things understandable." "Maybe I still can be," Ophelia mused. "Once Genoa grows larger, perhaps there will be need for a school." "You would be wonderful at it," Fletcher assured her. "But I admit, I am selfish enough to hope it does not happen too soon. I like having you here with me." Ophelia smiled and moved into his embrace. "I am not going anywhere," she promised. "Teaching would be a few hours a day at most. The rest of the time, I would still be exactly where I want to be." March arrived with the first hints of spring, the snow beginning to melt in earnest, revealing the brown grass beneath. The cattle grew more active, sensing the changing season, and Fletcher's workload increased as he prepared for calving season. Ophelia found herself taking on more of the ranch tasks, freeing Fletcher to focus on the herd. She learned to manage the chickens entirely on her own, even successfully treating one hen for an infected foot, using knowledge she gained from Fletcher's farming manual. She began a garden plot near the house, planning what vegetables to plant once the ground thawed completely. She took over all the cooking and household management, finding satisfaction in creating order and comfort. But the peace they had built was fragile, and they both knew it. The Dalton brothers had been suspiciously quiet since the confrontation in town, but Fletcher remained watchful. He took to riding the property lines more frequently, checking for signs of tampering. Twice he found fences damaged, though whether by accident or design, he could not prove. Ophelia kept her promise about record-keeping, even though her initial threat had been a bluff. She began documenting everything. Every encounter with the Daltons, every instance of damage to the property, every expense and income related to the ranch. She organized the papers carefully, creating a system that would stand up to legal scrutiny if needed. "You are meticulous," Fletcher observed one evening, watching her work at the table by lamplight. "I told Dalton I kept records," Ophelia replied without looking up. "I intend to make good on that claim. If they ever try anything significant, we will have evidence." Fletcher moved behind her chair and placed his hands on her shoulders, kneading gently. "You are remarkable, you know that. I sent for a wife and got a partner, an accountant, a ranch hand, and a fierce protector all in one." Ophelia leaned back against him, tilting her head to smile up at him. "You are not so bad yourself. I came west expecting a stranger and found my heart's home." The words were sentimental, almost embarrassingly so, but they were true. In the 2 months since her arrival, Ophelia had transformed from a frightened woman with no prospects into someone confident and capable, secure in her place and purpose. The change was not just in her circumstances, but in her very being. She had found herself here in this harsh and beautiful land, in the arms of this good and steady man. In early April, they received unexpected visitors. Ophelia was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Her stomach tightened with old fear, but when the wagon came into view, she saw it carried not the Dalton brothers but Reverend Hollies and the Johnsons. Fletcher emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants, surprise evident on his face. "Reverend, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. This is unexpected. We brought supplies," Mrs. Johnson called cheerfully, already climbing down from the wagon. "Thought you newlyweds might appreciate some fresh bread and preserves, and we wanted to check on how you were settling in, my dear." The visit turned into an impromptu social gathering, the first Ophelia had experienced since arriving in Nevada territory. They all crowded into the small house, and Ophelia served coffee and sliced Mrs. Johnson's bread, which was indeed delicious. The conversation flowed easily, touching on ranch news, town gossip, and the upcoming spring planting, but Reverend Hollies eventually turned serious, looking at Fletcher with concern. "I heard about more trouble with the Daltons," he said. "Word is they are getting more aggressive in trying to acquire properties in the valley." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "They have been quiet lately, but I am not fooled. They are planning something." "Have you considered filing a complaint with the territorial marshal?" Mr. Johnson asked. "Based on what evidence?" Fletcher replied with frustration. "Everything they have done is subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence or accident. I have no proof." "Actually, we do," Ophelia interjected, rising to retrieve her carefully organized records. She laid them out on the table, showing the detailed log of incidents, dates, and circumstances. "It may not be enough to convict them of anything, but it establishes a pattern of harassment." Reverend Hollies examined the records with growing respect. "This is excellent work, Mrs. Irwin. You are right that it establishes a pattern. Have you considered taking this to the marshal anyway, even without absolute proof?" "It is 2 days' ride to Carson City," Fletcher said. 2 days there and 2 days back. I cannot leave the ranch unattended for that long, especially not with calving season starting." "I could go," Ophelia said suddenly, the idea crystallizing even as she spoke it. "I could take these records to the marshal and make the complaint." "Absolutely not," Fletcher said immediately, his voice sharp with worry. "It is too dangerous. The roads, the weather, and if the Daltons found out you were going." Which is exactly why it makes sense for me to go, Ophelia argued. They would never expect it. They see me as just another helpless woman, and I would not go alone. Reverend Hollies and the Johnsons could accompany me, could they not? The three visitors exchanged glances. We could, Mrs. Johnson said slowly. We were planning to make the trip to Carson City next week anyway for supplies. You could travel with us. Fletcher stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Ophelia could see the tension in his shoulders, the war between his desire to protect her and his recognition that her plan made sense. Finally, he turned back, his expression troubled but resigned. I do not like it, he said. But you are right. It is the smart play. The Daltons are watching me, not you, and you would be safer with companions than I would be traveling alone. Then it is settled, Ophelia said, relief flooding through her. We will make the trip next week. The visitors left shortly after, promising to return the following week to collect Ophelia for the journey. After they were gone, Fletcher pulled Ophelia into his arms, holding her tightly. I know you can do this, he murmured into her hair. But that does not mean I have to like the idea of you being away, being potentially in danger. I will be careful, Ophelia promised, and I will come back to you. Nothing could keep me away now that I have found you. Fletcher pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. You are the bravest person I have ever known, he said seriously. When you first arrived here, I saw someone who was frightened but determined. Now I see someone who is simply fearless. Not fearless, Ophelia corrected. I am still afraid of many things. But I have learned that being brave does not mean having no fear. It means doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Fletcher kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Ophelia melted into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, even when temporarily apart. The week passed too quickly, filled with preparations for Ophelia's journey and the ongoing work of the ranch. Fletcher was teaching her more complex tasks, as if trying to cram months of instruction into days, preparing her to be self-sufficient. Ophelia absorbed everything, her natural intelligence and determination making her a quick study. They spent their evenings carefully reviewing the records she would take to the marshal, practicing the presentation of their case. Fletcher helped her anticipate questions and prepare responses, his mind sharp despite his lack of formal education. Ophelia realized anew how intelligent he was, how his years of surviving and building had honed his thinking to a keen edge. Their nights were precious and passionate, each one feeling potentially like the last before separation. They made love with an intensity born of impending distance, memorizing each other's bodies and hearts. They whispered promises in the dark, vows that went beyond the legal binding of marriage into something deeper and more elemental. The night before Ophelia's departure, Fletcher gave her a small pistol, compact enough to fit in her bag but substantial enough to be effective. I know you know how to shoot, he said, having discovered this fact during a casual conversation weeks earlier. But I want you to have this, just in case. Ophelia accepted the weapon, checking it with practiced efficiency. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was young, believing every person should know how to defend themselves. Thank you, she said. I hope I will not need it, but I am grateful to have it. You are full of surprises, Fletcher said, watching her handle the gun with competent ease. Every time I think I know everything about you, you reveal another layer. Good, Ophelia replied with a small smile. It will take you a lifetime to uncover them all, gives you a reason to keep me around. I would keep you around even if you were the simplest, most transparent person in the world, Fletcher said seriously. You are mine, Ophelia, the other half of my heart. I would keep you forever just for that. The tenderness in his words brought tears to Ophelia's eyes. "And you are mine," she replied, "my home, my love, my everything." They did not sleep much that night, unwilling to waste their last hours together in unconsciousness. They talked and touched and loved, storing up reserves of connection to sustain them through the coming separation. Morning arrived too soon, pale light creeping through the window. Fletcher rose and made coffee while Ophelia dressed in her traveling clothes. She packed her carpetbag carefully, including the records, the pistol, and enough clothes for a week's journey. The Johnsons arrived mid-morning with their wagon, Reverend Holly's riding alongside on horseback. Fletcher helped Ophelia up onto the wagon seat, his hands lingering on her waist. "Come back to me," he said quietly, for her ears only. "Always," Ophelia promised. "Nothing in this world could keep me away." She kissed him there in front of their neighbors, uncaring of propriety or what anyone might think. This was her husband, her partner, her love, and she was leaving him for the first time since their marriage. The kiss was a promise and a prayer, a binding that transcended distance. Finally, she pulled away and settled onto the wagon seat. Fletcher stepped back, his hand raised in farewell, and Ophelia kept her eyes on him as the wagon rolled forward, watching until he was just a distant figure against the backdrop of their ranch, their home, their future. Then she turned forward, squaring her shoulders. She had a mission to complete, a case to make, justice to seek. And when it was done, she would return to Fletcher's arms and the life they were building together. The journey to Carson City was long but uneventful. Mrs. Johnson proved to be excellent company, full of stories about the early days of settlement in the Nevada Territory. Mr. Johnson was quieter but had a dry wit that surprised Ophelia into laughter multiple times. Reverend Hollies rode alongside the wagon, keeping watch for any potential danger, though they encountered no one more threatening than a few other travelers heading in the same direction. They stopped each night at way stations, rough establishments that offered basic food and shelter. Ophelia shared a room with Mrs. Johnson, grateful for the older woman's presence. They talked late into the night, and Ophelia found herself sharing things she had never told anyone: the loneliness of her years in Boston, the fear that had nearly paralyzed her when she first arrived in Nevada, the way Fletcher had thawed her frozen heart with his steadfast kindness. "You love him," Mrs. Johnson observed, not a question but a statement. "More than I knew was possible," Ophelia confirmed. "I came west expecting duty and found devotion instead." "He is a good man," Mrs. Johnson said. "My husband has known him for years." "Fletcher has always been honest and hardworking, the kind of neighbor you want in hard country. But he has also been lonely, I think. He needed someone like you, someone strong enough to stand beside him." "I am not sure I was strong when I arrived," Ophelia admitted. "But he made me believe I could be, and somehow that belief became reality." Mrs. Johnson patted her hand. "That is what love does, dear. It shows us who we can become and then helps us get there." They reached Carson City on the third day, the territorial capital, a bustling town that seemed enormous compared to Genoa. Ophelia stared at the streets crowded with people, the buildings rising 2 and even 3 stories high, the obvious signs of commerce and government. They found lodging at a respectable boarding house, and the next morning, Ophelia dressed in her best clothes and gathered her carefully organized records. Reverend Hollies accompanied her to the marshal's office, a sturdy building near the center of town. Marshal Thomas Garrett was a man in his 50s, graying but sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had seen much and been impressed by little. He listened to Ophelia's presentation with careful attention, examining her records with growing interest. "This is thorough work, Mrs. Irwin," he said when she finished. You have documented a clear pattern of harassment. However, you are correct that it is not enough for arrests or prosecution. Everything here could be explained as coincidence or accident. Ophelia's heart sank, but the marshal held up a hand. That said, this is valuable information. The Dalton brothers have been operating in a legal gray area for years, pressuring smaller landholders into selling through intimidation. We have suspected their involvement in various incidents, but have never been able to prove anything. Your records add to our understanding of their methods. But what can be done? Ophelia asked, frustration evident in her voice. Marshal Garrett leaned back in his chair, considering. I cannot arrest them based on this evidence, but I can do several things. First, I can make an official record of your complaint, which will be on file if anything more serious happens. Second, I can pay a visit to the Daltons and make it clear that they are being watched. Sometimes simply knowing that law enforcement is aware of their activities is enough to make them reconsider their tactics. And if it is not enough, Ophelia pressed, then you and your husband need to be very careful, Marshal Garrett said seriously. Document everything that happens. If they escalate to violence or property destruction, send word immediately. I will ride to Genoa myself if necessary. But in the meantime, the best protection you have is awareness and preparation. It was not the outcome Ophelia had hoped for, but it was something. She thanked Marshal Garrett for his time and promised to keep him informed of any developments. As she and Reverend Hollis left the office, she felt a mixture of disappointment and determination. It was not a wasted trip, Reverend Hollis assured her. You have established an official record. That is important. I know, Ophelia agreed, but I had hoped for more, something that would ensure Fletcher's safety, our safety. Safety is never guaranteed in this life, Reverend Hollis said gently. All we can do is take reasonable precautions and then have faith. You and Fletcher are building something good and lasting. That is worth fighting for. They spent 2 more days in Carson City while the Johnsons completed their business, buying supplies and arranging for shipments. Ophelia used the time to purchase things for the ranch. Seeds for her garden, new tools Fletcher needed, fabric to make curtains for the bedroom. She was careful with money, but Fletcher had given her funds for necessities, and she was determined to make every penny count. She also visited a lawyer's office, one recommended by Marshal Garrett, and had formal documents drawn up clarifying her and Fletcher's property rights. The lawyer explained that, as a married woman, her legal standing was complicated, but he created papers that would protect her interests if anything happened to Fletcher. It was morbid planning, but Ophelia was practical enough to see the necessity. On their last evening in Carson City, Mrs. Johnson took Ophelia to a small shop that sold women's items. Every bride needs something pretty, she insisted, and helped Ophelia select a nightgown of soft cotton with delicate lace at the neck and sleeves. Fletcher will not care what I wear to bed, Ophelia protested, though she was already falling in love with the garment. But you will care, Mrs. Johnson replied with a knowing smile. And feeling pretty for yourself is just as important as for your husband. Ophelia bought the nightgown along with some other small luxuries. Proper soap, ribbon for her hair, a jar of hand cream to soothe her work-roughened skin. They were minor indulgences, but they made her feel human in a way that pure practicality could not. The journey back to Genoa seemed longer than the trip to Carson City, every mile an eternity between Ophelia and Fletcher. She found herself anxiously scanning the horizon, willing the familiar landmarks to appear. When they finally crested the rise that revealed the valley where Genoa lay, her heart leaped with relief and joy. Almost home, Mrs. Johnson said kindly, seeing the emotion on Ophelia's face. Almost, Ophelia agreed, and the word home had never felt so true. They reached Genoa in the late afternoon, and Mr. Johnson offered to drive Ophelia directly to the ranch. She accepted gratefully, not wanting to wait even an hour longer to see Fletcher. As the wagon rolled up the familiar road to the ranch house, Ophelia saw him emerge from the barn, alerted by the sound of approaching wheels. The moment the wagon stopped, Ophelia was climbing down, barely remembering to thank the Johnsons before running toward Fletcher. He met her halfway, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around, his face buried in her neck. "You came back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course I came back," Ophelia replied, clinging to him. "I promised you, did I not?" Fletcher set her down but kept his arms locked around her, as if afraid she might disappear. "How did it go? What did the marshal say?" Ophelia filled him in on everything as they walked to the house, Fletcher carrying her bag with one hand while keeping the other firmly around her waist. She showed him the documents she had obtained, explained the marshal's response, detailed the promises of support if the situation escalated. Fletcher listened intently, his expression grave. "So we are no better protected than we were," he concluded. "Not in terms of immediate action," Ophelia admitted, "but we have established an official record. The Daltons are now known to the territorial authorities as troublemakers. That is worth something." "It is worth more than we had," Fletcher agreed. He pulled her close again, resting his cheek against her hair. "I missed you so much. The house felt empty without you. I felt empty without you." "I missed you too," Ophelia confessed. "Every moment I was gone, part of me was still here with you." That night, they reconnected with an intensity that spoke of the days apart, the worry and longing transforming into passionate claiming. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in their bed, Fletcher traced patterns on Ophelia's bare shoulder. "I have been thinking while you were gone," he said quietly, "about the future, about what we are building here." "What conclusions did you reach?" Ophelia asked, shifting to look at him. "That I want more than just survival," Fletcher said. "I want to truly thrive. I want to expand the ranch, make it something that can support not just us but the family we might have someday. I want to build you a bigger house, one with a proper bedroom and a kitchen and maybe even a parlor where you could receive guests. I want to give you the life you deserve." Ophelia felt tears prick her eyes at the earnest hope in his voice. "Fletcher, I already have the life I deserve. I have you. I have purpose. I have a home where I am valued and loved. Everything else is just extra." "But you deserve the extras too," Fletcher insisted. "You gave up everything to come here. The least I can do is make it worth your sacrifice." "It was not a sacrifice," Ophelia said firmly. "It was an escape from a life that was slowly killing me. You saved me, Fletcher. You gave me a reason to live instead of just existing. Do not think for a moment that I settled for less. I gained everything." Fletcher kissed her then, tender and thorough, and she felt his love in every touch. "Then we will build our everything together," he murmured, "starting tomorrow." Spring arrived in full force, transforming the harsh landscape into something green and alive. The cattle began calving, and Fletcher was busier than ever, often spending entire days and nights in the pastures watching over the herd. Ophelia took over running the household completely and began working her garden in earnest, planting vegetables and herbs that would supplement their diet and could be preserved for winter. She also started keeping chickens more seriously, incubating eggs and raising chicks to expand their small flock. The income from selling eggs in town was modest but steady, and Ophelia took pride in contributing financially to the ranch's operations. One warm day in May, Ophelia was working in her garden when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see not the Dalton brothers but a young couple she recognized from town, the Wheelers, who owned a small farm on the other side of Genoa. "Mrs. Irwin," Clara Wheeler called out as they dismounted, "I hope we are not disturbing you." "Not at all," Ophelia assured her, brushing dirt from her hands. "What brings you out this way?" "We heard you might be willing to sell eggs," Clara's husband James said. "And we wanted to ask if you might be interested in a trade arrangement. We have a milk cow that produces more than we can use. If you would be willing to trade eggs for milk, we could both benefit." Ophelia's mind raced through the possibilities. Fresh milk would be a luxury, allowing her to make butter and cheese, improving their diet considerably. "That sounds like an excellent arrangement," she agreed. "Let me show you the hen house and we can discuss details." The trade deal was quickly struck, and it led to other connections. The Wheelers mentioned Ophelia's name to other settlers in the area, and soon she found herself at the center of a small trading network. Her eggs went to families who needed them, and in exchange, she received milk, fresh vegetables, and sometimes assistance with larger projects around the ranch. Fletcher was amazed at how Ophelia had managed to create community and commerce from their small operation. "You have a talent for this," he told her one evening as she tallied up the week's trades in her meticulous records. "You are building connections faster than I ever managed." "Women talk to each other," Ophelia explained. "We share information, form networks. Men sometimes see other ranchers as competition. Women see them as potential allies." "Smart," Fletcher acknowledged, "and profitable. The milk alone is worth more than the eggs we are trading." "True," Ophelia agreed. "But what we are really trading is goodwill and community. If we ever need help, we now have neighbors who will respond. That is worth more than any amount of money." Her words proved prophetic sooner than expected. In late May, Fletcher rode in from checking the northern fence line with his face set in grim lines. "Fire," he said tersely. "Someone set fire to the grassland along our northern boundary. I managed to put it out before it spread, but it was deliberately set. I found the evidence." Ophelia felt cold fear wash through her. "The Daltons. Who else?" Fletcher replied, his frustration evident. "But again, I cannot prove it. The fire is out and there were no witnesses." "We need to send word to Marshal Garrett," Ophelia said immediately. "This is escalation." "This is exactly what he said to report." Fletcher nodded. "I will ride to town tomorrow and send a telegram, but it will take days for the marshal to get here if he even comes. In the meantime, we need to be extra vigilant." That night, Fletcher loaded his rifle and placed it by the door. He showed Ophelia where he kept ammunition and made sure she remembered how to use the pistol he had given her. The easy peace they had enjoyed for weeks evaporated, replaced by watchful tension. But they were not alone in their vigilance. Word of the fire spread through Ophelia's trading network, and within 2 days, neighbors began showing up at the ranch. James Wheeler arrived with his brother, offering to help patrol the property. 2 other ranchers came with their eldest sons, volunteering to take shifts watching for trouble. Even Reverend Hollies appeared, saying he could not fight but he could keep watch and sound an alarm if needed. Fletcher was visibly moved by the outpouring of support. "I do not know what to say," he told the assembled group. "I cannot pay you for your time." "We are not asking for pay," James Wheeler said firmly. "The Daltons have been pushing around small operators for too long. If we do not stand together, they will pick us off one by one. You are fighting for all of us, whether you know it or not." So they organized shifts, men taking turns riding the property boundaries and watching the approaches to the ranch house. Ophelia kept them supplied with coffee and food, grateful beyond words for their presence. Marshal Garrett arrived 5 days after Fletcher sent the telegram, accompanied by 2 deputies. He examined the evidence of the fire, interviewed Fletcher and Ophelia, and then rode to the Dalton ranch to question the brothers. He returned looking frustrated. "They deny everything, of course," he reported. "And they have alibis, or at least they claim to. Without witnesses or concrete proof, my hands are tied." "So they can keep doing this?" Fletcher demanded, his anger finally breaking through. "They can harass us and threaten us and destroy our property, and there is no recourse." "I did not say that," Marshal Garrett replied calmly. "I said I cannot arrest them without proof, but I made it very clear that this area is now under increased scrutiny. I also let them know that I have detailed records of their activities, thanks to your wife's diligence. They are aware that if anything else happens, anything at all, I will be back with warrants and a much less friendly attitude." "Will that be enough to stop them?" Ophelia asked. "It might be," the marshal said. "The Daltons are bullies, but they are not stupid. They operate in gray areas because they do not want to risk serious legal consequences. Now that they know they are being actively monitored, they may decide your land is not worth the trouble. And if they do not—" Fletcher pressed. Marshal Garrett's expression hardened. "Then they will cross a line that allows me to take action. And when they do, I will bring the full force of the law down on them. You have my word on that. It was not perfect, but it was something." After the marshal left, Fletcher and Ophelia stood together on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. "This is not how I imagined our first months of marriage," Fletcher said quietly. "Constantly looking over our shoulders, worrying about what might happen." "No," Ophelia agreed. "But it has shown me something important. It has shown me that we are not alone, that we have built something here that matters to people beyond just ourselves." Fletcher pulled her close, and she leaned into his strength. "I suppose that is worth something," he admitted. "It is worth everything," Ophelia corrected. "Community, connection, people willing to stand with us. The Daltons may have money and power, but we have something they will never understand. We have each other, and we have friends who care. That makes us richer than they will ever be." The threat of the Dalton brothers cast a shadow over the summer months, but life at the ranch continued. The vigilance remained, with neighbors taking turns keeping watch, but as weeks passed without incident, the tension gradually eased. The Daltons had apparently decided that Fletcher's land was not worth the increased scrutiny, or at least that is what everyone hoped. Fletcher's cattle thrived, and he was able to sell several head at good prices, bringing in much-needed income. Ophelia's garden flourished beyond her expectations, producing abundant vegetables that she canned and preserved with Mrs. Johnson's patient instruction. Her egg trade expanded further, and she even began selling her preserves and pickled vegetables in town, adding another small stream of income. In July, Ophelia realized that her monthly courses had not appeared. At first, she thought it was simply the stress and physical labor affecting her body, but when August came and still nothing happened, she began to suspect the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complex mixture of joy and fear. A baby. Their baby. The tangible result of the love she and Fletcher shared. But also, a baby born into a life of uncertainty and potential danger in a harsh land far from doctors and modern conveniences. She waited until she was certain before telling Fletcher. One evening after supper, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is going to be 3 of us come spring," she said simply. Fletcher went utterly still, his hand motionless beneath hers. Then he turned to her, his eyes wide with wonder and something that looked like terror. "You are sure?" "As sure as I can be," Ophelia confirmed. "My courses have not come for 2 months, and I have been feeling slightly ill in the mornings." Mrs. Johnson confirmed my suspicions yesterday when I finally worked up the courage to ask her about the symptoms. Fletcher pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that suggested she had become infinitely more precious and fragile. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Ophelia, I do not have words for what I am feeling right now." "Terrified," Ophelia suggested with a shaky laugh. "Because that is certainly part of what I am feeling." "Yes," Fletcher admitted, "terrified, but also elated, amazed, grateful." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "You are going to be a mother. We are going to be parents. I never dared to imagine this." "Neither did I," Ophelia confessed. 6 months ago, I was alone in Boston with no prospects and no hope. Now I have a husband I love, a home, and a child growing inside me. It seems impossible." "It seems like a miracle," Fletcher corrected. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips with infinite tenderness. "I will take care of you," he promised. "Both of you. Whatever you need, whatever it takes." "I know you will," Ophelia said, leaning into him. "We will figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else." The pregnancy progressed through the late summer and fall, and Ophelia was grateful that she experienced relatively mild discomfort. She continued working the garden and managing the household, though Fletcher became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and avoid heavy lifting. The community rallied around them once again. Mrs. Johnson began teaching Ophelia the skills she would need for childbirth and infant care, sharing knowledge passed down through generations of frontier women. Clara Wheeler brought over baby clothes her own children had outgrown, soft little garments carefully mended and washed. Other neighbor women appeared with advice, supplies, and offers of help when the time came. Winter arrived early that year, with snow falling in November. Fletcher worked tirelessly to prepare, laying in extra wood and supplies, making sure they would be well provisioned if they got snowed in. He built a cradle in his precious spare time, carefully carving and sanding until it was smooth as silk, a labor of love for the child they had not yet met. Ophelia spent the long winter evenings sewing tiny clothes and blankets, her hands busy while her mind wandered over the future. Would it be a boy or a girl? Would the child have Fletcher's brown eyes or her green ones? Would they be healthy and strong, able to thrive in this demanding environment? "You are worrying," Fletcher observed one night, watching her face as she stitched. "Of course I am worrying," Ophelia replied. "I am going to bring a new life into this world. That is terrifying." "But you are not doing it alone," Fletcher reminded her. "You have me. You have neighbors who care. You have knowledge and preparation. And you have yourself, which is the strongest resource of all." Ophelia set aside her sewing and moved into Fletcher's embrace, settling against his chest. "When did you become so wise?" she teased gently. "When I married you," Fletcher replied seriously. "You have taught me so much about courage and resilience, about facing fear head-on instead of letting it control you. If I have any wisdom, it came from watching you live your life." The baby came in March, on a day when the snow had finally begun to melt, and the first hints of spring were emerging. Ophelia's labor started in the early morning hours, and Fletcher immediately rode to fetch Mrs. Johnson and Clara Wheeler, the two women who had agreed to serve as midwives. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. Fletcher paced outside the bedroom, helpless and terrified, listening to Ophelia's cries of pain and wishing desperately that he could take the burden from her. Mrs. Johnson emerged periodically to reassure him that everything was progressing normally, but normal felt like agony when the woman he loved was suffering. Finally, as midnight approached, a new sound filled the house: the sharp, indignant wail of a newborn baby. Fletcher froze, his heart seeming to stop and then restart with painful force. A baby. Their baby, alive and crying. Mrs. Johnson appeared in the doorway, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son," she announced. "A big, healthy boy with good lungs, and your wife is tired but well. Come meet your child." Fletcher entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Ophelia lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. And in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the smallest human Fletcher had ever seen. "Meet your son," Ophelia said softly, and there was wonder in her voice, awe at what they had created. Fletcher knelt beside the bed, hardly daring to breathe as he looked at the tiny face. The baby had stopped crying, his eyes struggling to focus on the new faces above him. He had a cap of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face that was somehow the most beautiful thing Fletcher had ever seen. "Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ophelia carefully transferred the baby into Fletcher's arms, showing him how to support the small head. The weight was almost nothing, but it felt like holding the entire world. Fletcher stared down at his son, this perfect, impossible creature, and felt tears stream down his face unchecked. "He is perfect," he managed. "You are perfect. I love you both so much." "We need a name," Ophelia said, watching her husband and son with exhausted contentment. "We never decided on a name." They had discussed possibilities but never settled on anything definite. Now, holding his son, Fletcher thought of his father, of the legacy he wanted to pass down. "What about Franklin?" he suggested. "After my father, Franklin James Irwin." "Franklin," Ophelia repeated, testing the name. "Frank for short, I like it. Frank Irwin. Welcome to the world, little one, Mrs. Johnson and Clara Wheeler left after ensuring that Ophelia and the baby were settled and comfortable. Fletcher spent the night in a chair beside the bed, unwilling to be separated from his new family, even for the few steps to the main room. He dozed fitfully, waking at every small sound the baby made, marveling at the reality of parenthood. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Frank proved to be a demanding baby, crying frequently and requiring constant attention. Ophelia recovered slowly from the birth, and Fletcher took over every household task he could manage, learning to juggle ranch work with caring for his wife and newborn son. But there was joy in the chaos. The first time Frank grasped Fletcher's finger with his tiny hand, the grip surprisingly strong. The first real smile, probably just gas but seeming directed at his parents with intentional delight. The way he settled when Ophelia sang to him, her voice soothing his fretful cries. The precious moments when all three of them dozed together in the bed, a tangle of family and love. The community once again proved their worth, with neighbor women appearing regularly to help with cooking and cleaning, giving Ophelia time to rest and recover. Mrs. Johnson came every few days to check on the baby and offer guidance. The support network that Ophelia had built through her egg trading and friendships now sustained them through the challenges of new parenthood. Spring turned to summer, and Frank grew from a newborn to a robust infant. He was, as Mrs. Johnson observed, thriving in the frontier environment, proving hardier than many city-raised babies. Ophelia regained her strength and gradually resumed her regular activities, though now everything was organized around the baby's needs and schedule. Fletcher was a devoted father, constantly finding excuses to hold his son or play with him. He carried Frank around the ranch, showing him the cattle and horses, explaining everything as if the infant could understand. Watching them together, Ophelia felt her heart might burst with love. "You are going to spoil him," she teased one afternoon, finding Fletcher making silly faces to entertain a giggling Frank. "I am giving him all the love and attention I never had enough of," Fletcher replied without embarrassment. He will know every day of his life that he is wanted and cherished. It was statements like these that reminded Ophelia of the loneliness Fletcher had endured before she arrived. The years he had spent building this ranch with no family to share it with. Now he had both, and he approached fatherhood with the same determined dedication he brought to everything else in his life. In August, they received surprising news. The Dalton brothers, facing increased scrutiny from territorial authorities and pressure from other ranchers in the valley, had sold their holdings and moved to California. The threat that had loomed over the ranch for so long simply vanished, as if it had never been real. "It is over," Fletcher said wonderingly when they received confirmation of the Daltons' departure. "They are actually gone." "We outlasted them," Ophelia replied, Frank balanced on her hip. "We stood our ground, built our community, and showed them they could not bully us into submission." Fletcher pulled both his wife and son into his embrace. "We did it together," he corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you. You came here frozen and afraid, and you transformed not just yourself but this entire place. You are the heart of our home, the strength of our family, and the reason I believe we can overcome anything." Life settled into a new rhythm, one defined by the seasons of the ranch and the needs of a growing child. Fletcher expanded the herd with the confidence that came from knowing his land was secure. Ophelia continued her trading network and even began teaching occasional lessons to children in the area, fulfilling her old dream of being a teacher in a modified form. Frank grew from infant to toddler, a sturdy child with his father's brown eyes and his mother's determined spirit. He took his first steps in the ranch yard, supervised by both parents and half the neighborhood who had gathered to witness the milestone. He spoke his first words, calling for Mama and Papa with equal enthusiasm. He became the darling of the community, passed from lap to lap during social gatherings, loved by everyone who knew him. The ranch prospered. Fletcher built the addition to the house he had promised, creating a proper bedroom for themselves and a small room for Frank. The kitchen was expanded, and Ophelia finally had the workspace she needed for her preserving and baking. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. 2 years after Frank's birth, Ophelia realized she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with less fear and more excitement, the confidence of experience replacing the terror of the unknown. She and Fletcher hoped for a daughter this time to complete their family. Their second child, a girl they named Olivia Rose, arrived in December 1875, a winter baby born during the first major snowstorm of the season. The birth was easier than Frank's had been, and Mrs. Johnson declared that Ophelia was becoming an expert at the whole business. Olivia was different from her brother from the start, quieter and more contemplative, content to observe the world with solemn eyes rather than demand its attention. Frank, now a rambunctious 3-year-old, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help care for her. "Our family is complete," Fletcher said one night as they lay in bed, Frank asleep in his room and Olivia in the cradle Fletcher had carefully refinished. 2 children, a thriving ranch, a home filled with love. I never imagined I could have all this. "You deserve all this," Ophelia replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "You worked for it, sacrificed for it, built it with your own hands. And you welcomed me into it with such generosity and kindness. I am the one who cannot believe my good fortune." "We saved each other," Fletcher said simply. "You arrived here frozen and afraid, running from a life that offered no future. I was here, alone and lonely, slowly turning into stone. But you thawed my heart just as I helped you find your courage. We made each other whole." Ophelia lifted her head to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. "And we will continue making each other whole," she promised, "for all the days we are given." The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, sickness and setback, the ordinary struggles of frontier life. But there was also joy. Watching their children grow, celebrating milestones, building community with their neighbors, expanding the ranch bit by bit until it became one of the most successful operations in the valley. Frank grew into a serious young man who shared his father's love of the land and his mother's quick mind. He learned to read and write from Ophelia's patient instruction and absorbed ranching knowledge from Fletcher's example. By the time he was 10, he was a genuine help around the ranch, capable and responsible beyond his years. Olivia developed into a gentle, thoughtful girl with a talent for art and music. Ophelia bought her a small piano on a trip to Carson City when Olivia was 8, and the sound of her daughter practicing filled the house with beauty. She was quieter than her brother, but no less determined, approaching everything she did with careful thoroughness. As the children grew, Ophelia and Fletcher's love deepened and matured. The passionate intensity of their early years mellowed into something richer and more complex, a partnership built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment. They knew each other's rhythms and needs, could communicate with a glance or a touch, anticipated each other's thoughts and feelings. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Fletcher surprised Ophelia by taking her back to Genoa, to the church where they had married. Reverend Hollies, now quite elderly but still sharp, renewed their vows in a small ceremony attended by the friends and neighbors who had become their extended family. "10 years ago, I promised to thaw your heart with kindness," Fletcher said, holding both of Ophelia's hands as they stood before the altar. "But the truth is, you thawed mine. You took a lonely, hardened man and taught him to love again, to hope again, to dream again. You gave me a family and a future. You gave me everything that matters, and I promise you now, as I promised you then, to spend every day of my life being worthy of the gift you have given me." Ophelia had to wipe away tears before she could respond. "You called me brave when we first met," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I was not brave. I was terrified. You taught me courage by believing I possessed it even when I did not believe it myself. You saw potential in me that I could not see. You gave me a home and a purpose, and a love I never dreamed possible. I promise to continue building our life together, to stand beside you through whatever comes, and to love you with my whole heart for all the days we are given." Their kiss was witnessed by their children, their friends, and the community they had helped build, and when they broke apart, there was not a dry eye in the church. This was more than just a marriage renewed. It was a celebration of everything they had overcome and achieved together, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and love. The years continued to roll forward. Frank, at 18, decided he wanted to study agriculture at the new land-grant college in California, a decision Fletcher and Ophelia supported wholeheartedly, despite the pain of separation. He left with their blessing and returned during summers and holidays, his education only increasing his value to the ranch. Olivia, at 16, surprised everyone by announcing her intention to become a teacher. Ophelia helped her study and prepare, passing on all the knowledge she had accumulated over the years. When Olivia was 18, she took a position at the new school in Genoa, living at home but spending her days teaching the next generation of frontier children. Fletcher and Ophelia, now in their 40s, settled into a comfortable middle age. Their hair showed streaks of gray, their faces were lined with years of sun and work, but they moved through life with the confidence of people who had faced challenges and prevailed. The ranch was paid off, profitable, and secure. Their children were launched into the world with every advantage Fletcher and Ophelia could provide. On quiet evenings, they still sat together on the porch as they had done from the beginning, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts and memories. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, presence enough. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked one such evening. "Answering my advertisement, coming all the way out here to marry a stranger?" Ophelia considered the question seriously, as she always did when Fletcher asked. "Not for a single moment," she said finally. "My life in Boston was a slow death. Coming here marrying you was a resurrection. You gave me life, Fletcher, real life. Not just existence, but purpose and love and family. How could I ever regret that?" "You gave me the same," Fletcher replied, lifting her hand to kiss her knuckles. "I was surviving before you came. You taught me to thrive. And every day I wake up next to you, I am grateful for the courage you showed in stepping off that stagecoach." "I was frozen with fear," Ophelia reminded him with a gentle smile. "And I promised to thaw your heart with kindness," Fletcher finished. "Best promise I ever made. Best decision we both ever made." They sat together as the stars emerged, two people who had found each other across distance and doubt, who had built something lasting and beautiful from unpromising beginnings. Around them, the ranch hummed with evening sounds. Cattle settling for the night, the rustle of wind through cottonwoods, the distant call of an owl. It was home, earned and cherished, the product of years of work and love and commitment. Frank eventually returned from college with a degree and a new bride. A capable young woman named Sarah who threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm reminiscent of Ophelia's own arrival decades earlier. They built a house on the property, and Frank took over more of the daily operations, giving Fletcher time to slow down and enjoy the fruits of his labor. Olivia married a few years later, a young doctor who had come to Genoa to establish a practice. They remained in town, but visits were frequent, and the connection between parents and daughter stayed strong. Grandchildren arrived, boisterous and beloved, filling the ranch with laughter and chaos. Fletcher and Ophelia delighted in their new role, providing wisdom and perspective, spoiling the little ones with attention and treats, then sending them home to their parents at the end of the day. As they entered their 60s, Fletcher and Ophelia finally stepped back from the daily demands of the ranch, handing full control to Frank while maintaining their home on the property. They had earned their rest, had built something that would outlast them, had created a legacy of family and community and perseverance. One summer evening, sitting in rocking chairs on the expanded porch of the house Fletcher had built and rebuilt over the years, they watched their grandchildren play in the yard while Frank and Sarah supervised. Olivia and her husband were visiting for the week, the whole family gathered in celebration of nothing more than being together. "We did well," Ophelia observed, contentment evident in every line of her body. "We did," Fletcher agreed, "better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do you remember that first day?" Ophelia asked. "When I stepped off the stagecoach in Genoa, so terrified I could barely speak." "I remember thinking you looked like you might bolt at any moment," Fletcher said with a chuckle. "And I remember deciding right then that I would do whatever it took to make you feel safe." "You succeeded," Ophelia said simply. "You thawed my frozen heart with your kindness, just as you promised, and in doing so you gave me everything I have now, this home, this family, this life." All of it traces back to that moment when you chose gentleness over demand, patience over expectation. "And you chose courage over fear," Fletcher added. You could have taken the easy path, gone back east when I offered. But you stayed, you fought, you built alongside me. Everything we have is because you were brave enough to believe we could create it together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold, the mountains standing eternal in the distance. The valley that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving decades ago now felt like a sanctuary, a place where they had planted roots deep enough to weather any storm. "I love you," Ophelia said, the words as fresh and true as they had been on their wedding day. "I love you for who you were then, who you are now, and who we have become together." "And I love you," Fletcher replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of devotion, "for all of that and more. You are my heart, Ophelia. You always have been, from the moment you stepped into my life." They reached for each other's hands, fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. The family sounds around them provided a backdrop to their private moment. The laughter of grandchildren and the quiet conversation of their adult children, all of it evidence of the life they had built from nothing but hope and determination. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Fletcher and Ophelia remained on the porch, unwilling to break the spell of perfect contentment. They had traveled a long road together, from strangers brought together by circumstance to partners bound by love. They had faced fears and overcome challenges, had created family and community, had turned a harsh frontier into a home. The mail-order bride who had arrived frozen and afraid had become a matriarch, beloved and respected. The lonely cowboy who had promised kindness had kept his word and gained everything in return. Together, they had proved that love could bloom in the harshest soil, that courage could overcome fear, and that the greatest adventures often began with the smallest act of faith. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but of steady persistence and daily choice. They had chosen each other again and again, through every challenge and every joy, building their happily ever after one day at a time. And now, in the golden years of their life together, they could look back and see the pattern they had woven, beautiful and strong and lasting. The wind carried the scent of sage and growing things, familiar and beloved. The ranch sprawled around them, prosperous and secure, a testament to decades of work. Their family surrounded them, the living legacy of their love. And as Fletcher squeezed Ophelia's hand and she squeezed back, they both knew with absolute certainty that they had found what every heart seeks: a place to belong, a person to love, and a life worth living. They had thawed each other's hearts with kindness, and in doing so had created warmth enough to last a lifetime.